Greetings of peace, love, and light. This is the 12th Path and Present podcast, which means we have been doing a podcast a month for 1 year. So happy birthday to the podcast, and thank you all for tuning in. It's been a beautiful ride, and it's been overwhelming to see all the places that people are tuning in from all around the world, all the love, and it's been great. We've had some amazing guests, and we hope to continue to spread this love and light through this medium. We have some really cool episodes coming up soon. I look forward to sharing those with you. Many people have said that some of the conversations in this podcast have been transformative or changed their life or been greatly beneficial, changed the way they see things. And that's really what it's all about. I started this podcast because as an artist, I have the ability to travel all over the world, meet with amazing people, artists, activists, scholars, spiritual teachers, you name it, people doing really beautiful things. And unfortunately, when I turned on the news or even most social media, I was just seeing a lot of negative things. And I was like, why is nobody highlighting some of the good things? So I had these conversations with these people that really changed me and transformed me and opened me and made me look at the world totally differently. And I would then come home and be like, man, I wish I could share those conversations with the people that I love. And then I realized, well, I guess I can. So that's how Path and Present was born. And it's really been organic and raw. It's not heavily edited. It's just a long form, honest, sincere conversation. And the whole idea is like a mic just happens to be on, but we're having real conversations. So that's the idea. And if you enjoyed it or benefited from it, then alhamdulillah, we've served our purpose. So we would like to do the podcast even more consistently, more than once a month if possible. And to do that, there's a few costs involved, an editor, we want to build a website, and all these things like that, as well as just taking the time to record it, get someone in the room, do all those things. So if you have benefited from the podcast or support it or like it or enjoy it in any way, you can now support it through Patreon. Patreon is a really cool site which allows people to support content creators. And basically, you can give as little as $1 a month or as much as you want. And that really just helps us cover our overhead costs. And it also gives us the ability to devote more time to the podcast. So if everybody who listens and enjoys the podcast could give $1 a month, $1 a month, it would be way more than we need. So anyway, if you have if you're balling, you know what I mean? You got extra bread, then break us off a few crumbs, and we will continue to bring you Path and Present podcast. And if you are totally broke and you have no dollar to give, and you're like, man, everybody keeps trying to take my money, I don't have money, then we are going to pray for you that you get expanded abundance coming your way soon. But the best way that I found to increase that abundance is to pray for others. So keep us in your prayers as well. So I don't want to be too verbose, but if you want to check that out, you can find the link to our Patreon page I'm sure if you just go to Patreon and search Path and Present Podcast, you'll find it. Or you can go to soundcloud.com/Path and Present, our SoundCloud page, and you'll see a link there. So check it out. It's pretty cool. There's some kind of gifts or bonuses you get if you give a certain amount. So check that out. And that will allow us to continue to do Path and Present and really, hopefully, in the coming year to actually start doing it more frequently. We would really like to increase the frequency. Increase the frequency. Yes. So this new podcast that you're about to hear is with Rory Dickson. He wrote an amazing book called Living Sufism in North America, Between Tradition and Transformation. I'm not going to say too much about it because we get into the details of the book, And we actually talked for about 2 hours. So enjoy. One love.
I guess your book is, for me, the way I look at it is it's separated into two parts. One is like setting the stage.
That's right, yeah.
And you're kind of going into the history. And it's two histories. It's the history of Sufism itself, which is actually a shorter section. You're kind of like, and then the longer section is actually a history of esoteric movements in the West.
Right.
Starting quite early. And so that's the first half. And then the second half is basically like a really interesting way to approach it is that you like did field work and you went and you talked to a group of Sufi teachers or a diverse range of Sufi teachers and asked them a series of questions.
Right, exactly.
So why did you structure it like that? Why is it like two parts?
It's a great question. I mean, and I think there's a few different answers. I mean, one of them is that the two parts of the book actually reflect the two sorts of academic training that I underwent, you might say. So I did a undergraduate degree in history, and to this day have a deep love of history. I love reading history. I enjoy writing history. It's something that I pretty naturally gravitate toward. And then when I was in graduate school, the program that I was a part of had an emphasis more on ethnography, field work, going out and meeting people, interviewing people, spending time with people, and really allowing yourself and your perspectives to be transformed by encounter. So getting off of the armchair and really getting out there. And so in some ways, the book reflects both of those trainings. It's got my love of history in it, and it's also got this very cool experience I had in graduate school learning to do field work and coming to appreciate its power. So I think that's partly where that comes from. The other thing that I would say is I think history is really necessary. I think we need to contextualize the present because so much of the present is echoes and reverberations of the past. And if we don't appreciate that, we have such a hard time understanding why things are the way they are in the present. And I think that can lead to a lot of problems. So specifically with this, questions like, for instance, Sufism and Islam, there's such an ahistorical sense that so many Muslims and non-Muslims have about this question. There's a sense of, well, if the Muslims in my area haven't really been into Sufism for the past 80 years, then Sufism has never been a part of Islam. But if you look historically, you might go, yeah, we'll go back 2 centuries, and the Muslims in your area were almost entirely what we might now call today Sufi-oriented. Even though they may not have thought of themselves as particularly Sufi, their understanding of Islam would have just seamlessly integrated elements that we now call Sufism into their spiritual life. So that's just one example of where I think, history is really important. And so when I did these interviews and I was meeting people and talking about adapting Sufism or changes in Sufism or the relationship between Sufism and Islam, I really felt it was important for people to have a pretty solid background historically to these contemporary debates so that they could be put in context.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I think, so many of my teachers, they always said, like, it's important to have historical consciousness and really understand where we stand and where we are in the moment. And I've reflected on that a lot, especially traveling teaches you this, is that like so many people and so much of us, we're just products of momentum. We're products of our environment, and we inherited a worldview and we inherited all these things. And unless you're somehow transported out of that, it's hard to see. It's like a fish doesn't know there's such thing as water. It's just swimming in the water. And then there's those few fish that jump out of the water and then and then he comes down and then he's like, oh, there's water. But you have to be taken out to know that. And
that's right.
And studying and reading history is another means than travel, because you can get transported to distant lands and distant places.
I think that's right. Yeah.
So I was really fascinated. I think maybe even like the highlight of the book for me was the way that you traced the history of Western esoteric movements, because
Cool.
I learned a lot. I mean, I always reflected on the more recent, the 60s and 70s counterculture, maybe a little bit earlier, like the Transcendentalists in America. But I always reflected about how, the phenomena of the fact that there's a yoga studio on every corner, and that Rumi is the #1 selling poet in America, and that they're teaching transcendental meditation in the boardroom and in the prisons. It's all one phenomena. It's all related. It's all this counterculture Americana, 60s and 70s, turning east for spirituality, questioning institutions of the previous generations, why things are the way they are. And, we kind of coming on the heels of that, that's kind of my parents' generation. I assume your parents' generation too. So we kind of inherit that. And, a lot of people, like you say, they don't really understand, but there was places and people and movements and dates. And there's a lot of really interesting things that opened it up. And so you highlighted that really well, but you even brought it back to like the medieval period and the early, Christianity and like Hermeticism and all that stuff. So I was hoping maybe you could just summarize a little bit of like what you were, the movements you talked about and how that played out, and set the stage really for Sufism to come to the West.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's, I have to say, in terms of writing the book, that chapter on, the genesis of Sufism in the West, and its the origins of that relationship going all the way back to the Renaissance and medieval periods. That aspect of the book was one where I probably learned the most in writing the book. Some of the other parts of the book I had spent time, let's say the history of Sufism within the Islamic tradition more broadly. That's something that I'd spent time and years, reading and learning about. But it was really in the process of doing this project and writing this book that I realized if I was going to write about Sufism in the West, Sufism in North America, that I needed to really go as far back as I could to look at the roots of that relationship. And so there was actually a lot of learning for me in that. And like yourself, to be honest, I was also kind of surprised by what I found and was really fascinated by it. In part because I think there is such a kind of cool, if subtle, interweaving of Sufi Islamic and Western traditions. So, to put it sort of simply, I mean, you get this interesting confluence, we might say, of some elements of Sufi thought with Western esoteric traditions, and that confluence seems to really meet in the Renaissance period, particularly in Florence, where there's this influx of texts, Greek texts coming into Florence, and there's this project of translating these texts into Latin. And these texts, Hermetic texts, Neoplatonic texts, really inspired. I mean, really, they inspired a huge part of the thought and culture of the Renaissance. But another piece of this puzzle was Raymond Lull, who came even earlier and was somebody who, interestingly enough, I mean, he got into Islamic and Sufi traditions largely as a missionary. He was living in the Iberian Peninsula, present-day Spain, and in a part of the country that had been recently reconquered from the Muslims. And so he was himself somebody who had a sort of born-again experience and became a very devout Christian, but he spent a lot of time studying Islamic texts, and in particular, from what we can tell, Sufi texts on things like the 99 Names of God. And so, interestingly enough, he wrote a number of works on these subjects, in part to try to basically to engage in polemics. I mean, to try to convert Muslims and say, look, we have traditions like this too in Christianity. But what's so interesting about it, as many scholars have noted, is in his efforts to become a Christian missionary, to Christianize Muslims, he himself became sort of Islamicized in a way.
And this was in Spain in was it the 1200s?
Yeah, that's I think if you go back to the 12th century, basically. So,
because
13, 14.
Because he was there, he was, he was in the newly reconquered, lands that were recently taken from the Muslims. So it was still like an Arabic speaking community and all that stuff.
That's right. Yes. I mean, he was really kind of swimming in that culture. But I mean, what's kind of cool about that is you see influences of Lull that really percolate for a while in Europe, but really come to light, I think, in the Renaissance with people who we now look to as the founders of what is called the Western esoteric tradition. So people like Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, they were living in the 15th century in Florence and were engaged in these projects of translation, and were really into things like Neoplatonicism, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and also Lull's work. And so, I think we see this kind of Sufi influence coming through Lull onto people like Ficino and Mirandola. And what's so interesting about that is Ficino and Pico della Mirandola and some others writing in Florence at the time really plant a lot of seeds, intellectual, spiritual, that really take time to gestate and sprout forth. And one of the ideas that comes out of that period is the perennial philosophy. Mm-hmm. I mean, the idea of a perennial philosophy, I think, is probably older and found throughout the world in various forms. But a particular understanding of it really takes shape then, that there is this sort of one underlying truth to the world's various religions and philosophies. And I think what's so neat about that is that idea, along with a few others, really then shapes the esoteric mystical revival of the late 19th century, early 20th century. Mm-hmm. And it is that revival that Sufism as a living tradition first interacts with. Mm. Right? So we've got Hazrat Inayat Khan coming over from India to North America and eventually Europe as well. And he is dealing with people who are involved with things like the Theosophical Society, Transcendentalism, and really those movements are building upon the foundation laid by people like Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. And again, that foundation was itself influenced by Lull, who was influenced by Sufi literature and ideas. So you get this kind of very interesting confluence where the first sort of pouring of Sufism into a Western cup, we might say, is pouring it into a cup that has, in part, in a very subtle but real way, been shaped by Sufism. So.
That's beautiful. Yeah, Lullism, right? I mean, there was like a whole movement. At first, he was looked down upon by the Pope, right? Because maybe he had a little too much Muslim influence or something like that. But then eventually he became very popular. It took a few hundred years for Lull's work.
That's right.
Yeah, that was kind of, in reading the book, that part was really amazing to me because I had never even heard of this individual. And yeah, it had this really ironic, I mean, he basically wrote a book based on the 99 names, but it was like he had to add one, right? It was the 100 something.
Right, and there's the polemics, I think, right? I mean,
right. Yeah. Muslims have 99, I will have 100. But yeah, that's no, right. I mean, it's really fascinating. And so yeah, you kind of bring us up the fact that the Transcendentalists are reading and loving Sufi poetry, particularly Persian Sufi poetry. I think that's a story that people are starting to talk about more, but it's really important. I mean, right, Emerson is seen as like the America's great poet, right. And, or philosopher, and Whitman as the great poet, and, they are deeply, deeply affected by Sufi poetry,
right,
and Sufi thought in general. So you mentioned Hazrat Inayat Khan, and one thing that I really loved, like when I was reading it, and you framed it around the two individuals that kind of spark, you could say, in the early 20th century, this this kind of Sufism in the West, the fact that you framed it around these two individuals, I felt like that was really brilliant, Inayat Khan and René Guénon, because they really represent in many ways like the two ends of the spectrum on some level, but there's this overlap, and this really more overlap than I even knew, as far as like, you know, the theosophical piece and reacting to it or trying to incorporate it.
That's right. Yeah.
So I just, if you could, for those that aren't necessarily familiar with that history, if you could kind of summarize the life and the work of each of those individuals, because the way you did it in the book was beautiful, and it kind of helps frame the different spectrum of Sufism in North America.
Yeah, and I think those two figures for me, I wanted to focus on. One, because I think they do represent two of the first teachers of Sufism, we might say, even though René Guénon would have not necessarily been somebody who was initiating Westerners into Sufism, but he himself was initiated into a Sufi order and lived his life as a devout Sufi Muslim. And his writings have been hugely influential. And then Hazrat Inayat Khan really, I think, was the first Sufi teacher to come to North America in particular and begin initiating people into the path as a living tradition. Whereas prior to that, you have, as you described, more of a literary influence from Persian Sufism onto people like Emerson and others. So what I find so fascinating about these two figures is that they present very different sorts of Sufism, and I think they present two very different sorts of Sufism that creates a sort of tension, a creative tension, I think, between affiliating Sufism quite closely with adherence to Islamic law, Sharia, and the five pillars of the faith, the basic practices, and an approach to Sufism that says it's more of a universal spiritual essence that can be practiced in a whole variety of forms that doesn't necessarily need to be tied to Islamic practice and law and identity. And what's so interesting about this is that Hazrat Inayat Khan is the one who is teaching a more universal understanding of Sufism, and yet he himself is a Muslim coming from a traditionally Muslim context, a Muslim community in India, whereas René Guénon becomes somebody who believes quite strongly that Sufism can only legitimately be practiced within the boundaries of Islamic identity and faith and practice. And yet he is a convert, in a sense. He's a French scholar and practitioner who adopts Sufism as his path. So a very interesting contrast between those two figures. But to try to, I guess, sum up each of their lives briefly, René Guénon was somebody who was a student in Paris at the turn of the 20th century and got really into the underground esoteric scene there, which was a very rich scene. I mean, really, there were a lot of esoteric movements, and he was really drawn to them, and including things like the Theosophical Society, Masonic orders. And he gets involved in these, but really looking for authentic initiation. I mean, I think that's really important to keep in mind, that for people like Guénon, and his perspective would influence the traditionalist movement as a whole. But Guénon is really interested in authentic initiation. He believes that if you do not have an authentic initiation, that you will not be able to access the fruits of the spiritual life. And so in a way, he's questing. He's going on this quest to find an authentic initiation. And so he experiments with various Western esoteric traditions, again, like the Theosophical Society and Masonry. And although he finds some things that he likes, certainly the Theosophical Society perpetuates the ideal of a perennial philosophy that, again, we can see going back to the Renaissance. And he really likes that. I mean, I think Guénon is really struck by this idea. There is one primordial original truth that is then sort of fragmented in history, and in a sense this project of trying to recover that, of trying to get back to this primordial, pure, holistic truth. And so he likes that from the theosophical teachings, but there's a lot that he doesn't like. And I think at some point, overall, these Western esoteric and groups in Paris leave a bad taste in his mouth, and he really is looking for something else. And so he ends up studying at some more traditional Catholic institutes in France. And it's there, I think, that he starts to encounter this sense of the importance of tradition. That if you want to have true, holistic, balanced, integral spiritual wisdom and knowledge, that this is only accessible within a tradition, because a tradition is something that has been built up over time by wise, realized people, and it packs within it all of the materials that you need for your journey, which otherwise you either won't make it or you'll end up going off course, right? So I think there's that general sense that tradition really offers a lot, and in fact is necessary for completing the spiritual path. So I think then you get this combination in Guénon of this perennialism, this understanding that there's this one truth that underlies all the world's various religions and philosophies, but that if one is going to access this truth, this original truth, one has to do it through a coherent tradition. And so this is really important. Guénon doesn't think that everyone has to become a Muslim or everyone has to become a Christian or a Buddhist or a Hindu, but he thinks you do have to be one of them. Mm-hmm. You know, you do have to have a tradition that you adhere to quite closely, and through that tradition and through practicing it in an integral way, one is able to access the esoteric truth at the heart of this tradition, which itself is an embodiment of this primordial, this original truth. So I think that hopefully is a summary of Guénon's perspective. So I think you can see within that when he becomes a Muslim, he believes that that's necessary for him to access the original pure truth at the heart of the religion that he would affiliate with Sufism.
Right. So, yeah, you know, Guénon is looking for this lost core, this lost essence, this lost esoteric wisdom, which is this primordial wisdom. And his early writings are about the Vedanta and Taoism particularly. And, you know, it's fascinating. He actually goes to Egypt, you know, and he intends to only go for a few months to gather some texts on Sufism to translate for some publication in France. And he just ends up never leaving.
That's right, yeah.
And living the life of a pious Muslim, you know,
right.
Marrying a local woman, taking a Sufi sheikh in Cairo, and, you know, just living a very humble existence.
That's right.
As like a traditional Egyptian man, basically. But at the same time, he was still writing about the kind of perennial philosophy, and he was still writing about other traditions. Is that true? Like when he was in Cairo, he was still corresponding and writing for journals in the West and things like that.
It's a very good point to bring up, because to me this is one of the most fascinating elements of Guénon and of, I think, the what we might call traditionalism, which is capital T, kind of the movement that's named after him and then his colleague Putjov Shuan, who would really kind of take over leadership of this movement. But starting with Guénon, I mean, you see this really fascinating confluence of, as you described, an outwardly very orthodox, traditional Muslim life. I mean, at some point, he would have just been totally indistinguishable from, I think, any pious Egyptian, you know, going to the mosque regularly, having a family, and living his life out quietly. That's definitely the case. Now, interestingly enough, what separates him from many others in that context was that, yes, he still was interested in other traditions, and he believed that, in particular, Vedanta, the philosophy within Hinduism, sort of a non-dual philosophy within Hinduism, that basically says Atman, the soul, is Brahman, is the absolute, that the self, the kernel of the soul is itself the absolute, that there's no duality between them. For him, that expression of metaphysical truth was the most explicit expression of this truth among the various religions. Mm-hmm. So, in a sense, he understood or read Sufism through the lens of Vedanta, which is a kind of very interesting mixture there. Now, that's not to say that there isn't, in fact, similar traditions. The traditions of Ibn al-Arabi and his school of thought, in some cases, certainly do show some similarities and overlap with Vedantic traditions. But both Guénon and later Schuon believed that the particular expression of this, and for them, one metaphysical truth that's being expressed in a variety of ways, but the particular expression found in Vedanta, in the Hindu tradition, they thought was one of the most explicit and pure. And they felt in some ways that other expressions could get, in a way, obscured by theological or moralistic concepts. And so they really liked Vedanta as being a particularly pure, explicit expression of what they believed to be the central truth of the primordial tradition. And so, again, I think it's a very good point to bring up that you have this interesting confluence of, Orthodox Islamic practice with a somewhat Vedantic perspective.
Yeah, no, it's super fascinating. And, it's interesting, too. We talked about the Transcendentalists, and, I mean, they were deeply influenced. Emerson was really interested in Vedanta, and,
Yes.
they were all really... So it's interesting. They were... You could say that the Transcendentalists were interested or influenced primarily by Neoplatonism,
Yes.
and then Indian philosophy, and then Persian Sufism.
Yes, I think that's a nice summary of maybe the big three, we might say. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I've actually talked with some, Vedanta teachers about this, and that, what's really fascinating is that within Sufism, there's a lot about this kind of non-dual, you could say. I mean, there's this whole tradition of shatiyat, these kind of mystical utterances, which, and a lot of the poetry and a lot of the, prose even is really getting at the subtleties, but, and a lot of Sufism is dancing around the relationship with the human subjectivity and the ultimate reality. Because,
Right.
Ultimately, you could say you can't really utter it anyway. And even if you do utter it, it's not going to benefit you because, as the Sufis say, like, you can't explain honey to someone who's never tasted it. And
Right.
it's like, just give them a spoonful of honey. Like, forget a whole library written about honey. Like, that's not going to benefit you. Like, you just need a spoonful. And so, in a certain sense, you could say, my own, like, reflection on it is, like, the Sufis kind of emphasized the initiatic chain to access that reality. And let's be careful about talking about it because it sounds outwardly pretty much like it transgresses against the foundational principle of La ilaha illallah.
Right.
But on another side, it is the most profound articulation of La ilaha illallah.
That's right. I think that's well put. Yeah.
But maybe we can get into that a bit more. But just to go into Inayat Khan, so we get this the polarities.
Yeah. So in sort of in contrast to Guénon, we have Inayat Khan, who again is somebody who's coming out of the Indian Sufi tradition, and he's trained in that tradition with a sheikh from the Chishti order, and so he's initiated and eventually recognized as sheikh. And he's also a very accomplished musician in classical Indian forms of music. And he, at some point, is called upon by his teacher to bring Sufism to the West. And you get the sense in his autobiographical writings that there's a sense of mission of needing to join the East and the West, to bring them together, to kind of create a more holistic tradition. And so he goes to the West with Sufism, and initially does try to teach what we might consider to be more Islamic elements of the Sufi path, things like the Shahada, Salat, the daily prayer, recitations from the Quran. And initially he does this, but he finds in general that the Westerners he's encountering are really not that interested in becoming Muslim. They're not really that interested in Islamic traditions as a whole. And what he does find, though, is a great many of them have been influenced by things like the Theosophical, groups like the Theosophical Society and Transcendentalism. And so what he does is he has this sense of wanting to convey this message of the transformation of the soul, the oneness of humanity, the oneness of God, the oneness of reality. And he increasingly feels like the times call for a more universal message, that the times call for even the eventual dissolution of boundaries between religions and philosophies, a sort of coming together of the world's traditions. And so that immediately marks him as being someone quite different in his approach from Guénon, because whereas Guénon said the traditions need to remain, in a sense, separate. I mean, he was also very concerned about syncretism. He didn't think that any sort of mixing of traditions was going to lead anywhere, that it would just dilute both, and you'd end up with something that doesn't really take you anywhere. He thought it was a very negative thing, that really one wanted to find a coherent, integral tradition and adopt that and follow it separately from the others, even though one might be aware of the others and might appreciate the truths within them and acknowledge them as being perfectly valid. Still, you stick with your own. Whereas with Inayat Khan, we have more this sense of an emphasis on a universalism that sort of dissolves the boundaries between traditions and a comfort in integrating different elements. So he created rituals where, they would light candles for the different religions, and they would read from the scriptures of different religions, and really kind of creating this ideal of a universal religious tradition that sort of encompasses them all. And so that is, I think, is a really important difference between Inayat Khan and Guénon. But again, both there you see a theosophical influence. I mean, Inayat Khan was in a way presenting Sufism much more in accord with the theosophical vision of this coming oneness of humanity. Whereas, as you said before, Guénon was, in a sense, reacting against it. But one of the best ways that I've heard Inayat Khan's tradition described is that it is very much a sort of core of the Chishti Sufi or South Asian Sufi tradition. I mean, that's its core. That's the core spiritual training that you find within the now called the Inayati order. I mean, it was called the Sufi Order of the West or the Sufi Order International. But that's its core, really, is what we might call a sort of classical Sufi tradition. But that core is then sort of packaged or presented in a universalistic theosophical model, we might say. So, yeah, that's maybe one of the main points of contrast between the two of them.
And for timeline, Inayat Khan was, he came in the first decade of the 20th century, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So he basically he landed in New York in 1910, and to my reading, that really begins the presence of Sufism in North America as a living tradition, with a sheikh who begins teaching people, initiating people into the Sufi path. Yeah.
And you've brought out something really amazing, which is that basically for the next 4 decades. Or almost 5 decades, that was what defined Sufism, because there really wasn't a lot of other manifestations of living Sufi teachers articulating what Sufism is. So he was really defining it, for decades.
That's right. And I think that's important too, because when we look at general conceptions of Sufism in North America, and I find this too in conversations with people. I'll tell them, this is what I research and study, and sometimes they'll say, yeah, but and I'll tell them about doing Islamic studies, and they'll say, whoa, what does Sufism have to do with Islam? I thought Sufism was something just like this sort of universal spiritual teaching. And in an interesting way, some of that popular impression that one might come across has its roots in these decades of Inayat Khan's Sufi universalism, we might say, taking root in North America, and for a while really being the only game in town. It's not really until the 1970s that you start to see teachers from various parts of the world coming into North America and bringing with them lineages and presenting those lineages in ways that fit more closely with Islamic identity and practice.
So that kind of brings us up to the 60s and 70s counterculture. How does Sufism fit into that general turning east for spirituality?
Yeah, so I mean, to me, and it sounds like you might share this. I mean, I look back on the 60s, late 60s and early 70s in particular, as just one of the most fascinating periods of the 20th century. And, you know, so much of the cultural change that takes place then continues to shape our social context now in North America. And I think it was a really rich creative time. You know, you've got this confluence of the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, you've got the anti-war movement, you've got the psychedelic movement, and all of these things are happening and really influencing and I think changing the culture. And one of the interesting things that you see at this time is a lot of young people who are experimenting with psychedelics and through those experiences encountering different states of consciousness and being that really kind of get them intrigued by the possibility of exploring consciousness in a more systematic manner. And so they really, building off of the foundations laid by people like Emerson and the Theosophists, you know, they can draw upon these resources that are in Western culture. And one of those resources suggests, as Emerson and many others did, that you go east, that you look east, that there is there one finds particularly powerful esoteric mystical traditions. And so a lot of young people do, you know, either they go to India, they go to Afghanistan, they go to Japan, you know, they begin studying Zen Buddhism, they begin studying Vedanta, Kashmir Shaivism, they begin studying Sufism. You know, at that time, Sufism is, I think, seen as one of these Eastern mystical traditions that allows people to more systematically explore consciousness and ideally sort of elevate it. So, yeah, I mean, I think at that time, Sufism definitely fits within, although I don't know if it's as prevalent as, let's say, Zen. I mean, Zen in the 1950s with the beat poets, you know, you've got Beat Zen, you've got D.T. Suzuki writing about Zen Buddhism in a popular way that really catches on, Alan Watts. And then in the 1960s and 70s, you get more Zen teachers coming over to the United States in particular, and you get kind of an explosion of interest in Zen Buddhism. I would say same with certain Hindu traditions, again, Vedanta, actually going back to around the time of Hazrat Inayat Khan, even a little bit before, you have Vedantic traditions coming in. And really, I think you see more of that happening in the 1960s and 70s. So the Hindu gurus, Zen masters, you know, these become people that many young people coming out of the psychedelic movement go to and say, look, you know, can you show me how to transcend, you know, the limitations of my everyday self? Can you show me how to access deeper levels of consciousness? Now, Sufism is on the scene as well, but again, as from what I can tell, it was maybe less popular or prevalent, but still very much present. And so how are people accessing Sufism at this time? Well, two of the ways that I pointed to, one are the writings of Idris Shah. Fascinating character. To be honest, I straight up am not sure what to make of Idris Shah. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, you know, there are a lot of academics who outright dismiss him as basically a charlatan, you know, somebody who really didn't have Sufi lineage, you know, really wasn't a Sufi teacher. He was just writing what we might call spiritual fiction, you know, really entertaining stuff.
Carlos Castaneda.
Exactly. Like basically a Carlos Castaneda figure, right? Somebody who seems to be presenting something profound, but perhaps it's a little bit more fictionalized than we might realize. And that's certainly a possibility. I don't know. I mean, he was, I think, rightfully critiqued for mystifying his own background. I mean, the Sufis that I've encountered, and I think historically, if you look at Sufism, they tend to be very explicit about where the teachings come from. This is my sheikh or sheikha. And if they don't have a living one, they say, yes, maybe there is the spiritual form of a teacher that's passed that has initiated me. But they can name somebody, and most often it's through a lineage. And so when you don't find that with Idris Shah, he claimed to have a Naqshbandi lineage, but again couldn't really point to precisely what that was. He described it as a sort of hidden branch of the order. I think he was rightfully criticized in general for that. At the same time, I've read his books and I do enjoy them, and they're in many ways brilliant. And they sold phenomenally well. And really, for a lot of Westerners, that was their first encounter, in the 20th century at least, with Sufism. He really popularized this idea of Sufism as a sort of hidden underground teaching that crops up everywhere in history and is at the heart of a lot of what we think is great and cool about the West and the modern world. But again, I don't really know what to make of Shah. I know there are people who have defended him, some of his students. I think Doris Lessing was one who said, he really defended him and said he was a great teacher and an honorable person. And then there were others, especially in the academy, who really kind of lambasted him as a fraud. So, I'll leave that up to readers and anyone, I guess, who's interested can decide for themselves. But that's certainly one of the ways in the 1960s that we see people encountering Sufism.
Yeah. And like what you're saying is really important. And there's one story that an elder of mine who I had the opportunity to spend some time with in Morocco named Dr. Kenneth Honorkamp, Abdulhadi Honorkamp. And I think he teaches at University of Georgia or something like that. But anyway, he had a really fascinating journey in that, he was coming up in that age, like 60s, early 70s, and he was, probably experimenting with psychedelics. And I'm really glad, by the way, that you bring that up, because I think a lot of people that didn't go through that trajectory or aren't really familiar with it don't really understand how profound of an element that really was for shifting the whole cultural context. Because, and I think people that have experienced, as Jimi Hendrix would say it, who really have experienced, they have no doubt that, and there's all these metrics actually, in psychology of like, I forget exactly the word they use, but it's like someone's openness to new ideas. Right. So there's a spectrum, and there's certain people that are very closed-minded and they're rule-minded, and they just get, this is how we do it. I'm going to enforce the law, and I'm going to tell on you if you're not doing it right. And you know what I mean? Yep. And then there's people that are very open to new ideas, and they're willing to look at things very different ways. And all these studies have shown people that have done things like, LSD even one time, it totally moves you down the spectrum where now you're totally open to new ideas. I don't know. Let's look at it. I'm not sure. And you start to question things in this really profound way. So it totally alters your cognitive frames for many people. And like you say, people just come into contact with very profound, expansive states of consciousness, almost like paradise realms and hell realms. And a lot of it is like, religious symbolism presents itself. And, and so then people are like, okay, I need a map for what I just experienced. Like I need a key to decipher this. And so a lot of people start turning, like you say, to these Eastern traditions that put emphasis on understanding consciousness, transforming consciousness. And but anyway, so Abdulhadi Honorkamp, it's an amazing story, and it kind of like is a beautiful little thread to follow how a lot of this happened. So he went probably in the early 70s, and he was like, I'm going to India, right? Ram Dass had just come back and all that stuff. So, the Beatles were like with Maharishi and like, you know what I mean? So it's on the cover of Time. Everyone's going to India. And so he said the cheapest way to do it at the time was to take like a boat, like a tanker, and you go all the way up through the Mediterranean to Istanbul. And then from Istanbul, you take the train over land, and it goes, right, over Turkey, it goes Afghanistan, it goes Iran, Pakistan to India. And of course, they're all Muslim countries. So you have all these hippies. That's the hippie trail. And so, right? And like we just named pretty much the whole axis of evil also, but back then it was like he was like it was totally open. Like there was all these, you know, long-haired hippies getting off at every stop and experiencing these traditional cultures, which many places still didn't have, you know, electricity. Very much in a very traditional, you know, world. And Abdul Hadi just talks about like, you know, buying calligraphy in Istanbul. He had no idea what he says, but he liked it. And then, you know, being in the Swat Valley in Pakistan and riding some bus and being on the top of a bus and coming down and seeing this humongous wooden, like pagoda looking thing with like these huge flags flapping in the wind in the Swat Valley, and hearing a voice. He said he literally heard a voice that said, if you leave this valley, you'll never find what you're looking for. Wow. And so he was with a friend, then they're on their way to India, and they stayed for a few days in this village. And then the friend said, well, I'm going to continue on. He said, go ahead, I'm going to stay. There's something tells me I have to stay. And so he stayed there, and he found out that pagoda, those people that kept going to the pagoda, it was at the bottom of the valley, and he would, at nighttime, they would walk with their lanterns, because there was no electricity, downhill to this building, and then they would walk uphill back. And he said he felt like they were just floating up and down the hill. He would watch the lanterns at night, every, you know. And he went in and he realized, he didn't really know anything, but he realized it was a mosque. And it was like a traditional kind of like Swat Valley mosque. Like he said, the floor of it was actually dried grass that they would prostrate on. And it was like, you know, doesn't look like any mosque with stereotypical mosque with a dome. It was very much in the kind of quote unquote indigenous architecture. Right. But he lived there and he apprenticed with a tailor, and he started learning like how to be a tailor, and he ended up becoming Muslim in that valley and living in that valley for 10 years. Wow. And he learned the language and he studied traditionally with the sheikh and the whole thing. But, you know, before all that, a month or two later, after he became Muslim, his friend comes back. And he said, oh, hey, man, you're here. He said, how are you doing, Ken? He said, I'm not Ken anymore, I'm Abdul Hadi. He said, how are you doing, Mike? He said, I'm not Mike anymore, I'm Abdurrahman. So he had become Muslim somehow, and he said the way that he did it is that he was on a bus going to India, and a little old man gets on the bus, and he walks slowly at the bus stop, slowly on the bus, and he walks down the aisle, and he misses all the other empty seats, and he sits right next to him. And, you know, he's just silent, and they go, and then he looks at him, he says, who is your prophet? And this dude, you know, imagine a hippie from America, he goes, I don't have a prophet. You know, like, I don't. And he goes, and he said he just looked at him with, like, sincere sadness. Like, you don't have a prophet? Like, sincerely. And then he just, and then the next stop came, and he got off slowly, and he left. And then the bus departed, and Abdurrahman, who I know now, he runs a language school in Marrakesh, very beautiful brother. Wow. He told me that on the next stop, he got off, and he said, where's the mosque? I need to become a Muslim. Because he felt so empty at that moment, like, I don't have a prophet. I need a prophet, you know? I need a guide on the path. And so they both, but, you know, these are like the fascinating stories. And I know another one is someone who you actually mentioned in your book was Abdul Haq Godless. And he actually, very similarly, but he was in Iran. So, I mean, all this turning east, counterculture is very central. And then another individual who you mentioned in the book and who is just a character. I've heard many people talk about him. And so I hope maybe you could talk about him and how he ties into this whole moment, you know, Sufism and the counterculture, 60s and 70s, is Sufi Sam.
Yeah, Sufi Sam, I mean, very fascinating character indeed. Somebody who was a student of Hazrat Inayat Khan, somebody who was very well traveled. He went all over the world, all through South Asia, East Asia. He was very open to a variety of traditions. He's very interested in things like Zen, but I think was actually quite well grounded in the Sufi tradition, maybe more than he's given credit for. If you look at his writings, you know, he's clearly very well grounded in the tradition. And I think a very charismatic teacher. And interestingly enough, at some point later in his life, while he's recovering in the hospital, he has this sense of being called to be a teacher to the hippies in the Bay Area at the time, which is where he was based. So in the Mission District of San Francisco, he starts hosting these teaching sessions, and also in part through interaction with Inayat Khan's son, Vilayat Inayat Khan, he comes up with these universal dances of peace, and which at the time was just called Sufi dancing. And this really becomes a fixture on the countercultural scene at the time. I mean, I think they opened for the Grateful Dead at some point in the Bay Area. And that I think is another way that, especially in that part of the country, young people start to encounter Sufism. And what I love about that is how it creates this incongruity. You know, there's people who at that time would encounter the Sufi dancers who would be in their dancing and singing, including chants from a variety of different traditions. And for a lot of people, then they start to think of Sufism as being this very chill, open, you know, world peace and spirituality and eclecticism. And that gets associated in the minds of many with Sufism. And then, of course, in the 70s, when you have more Muslim teachers coming over, they're then going, oh, wait, well, here's this person who's a traditional Muslim sheikh with a turban and a beard, and that's also Sufism. You know, so I dig how that creates this incongruity there.
Mm. Yeah, so there's so much with the history, and really it could go on and on. But I want to get to the second half of the book, which you could even say was the heart of the book. Like once you set the stage,
right?
Then you talk to a wide variety of Sufi teachers, and you ask them a series of questions. So I guess my question about that is, what were the questions, the main questions you asked, and why were those the specific questions that you were most curious about?
Right. So out of the various questions that I asked the teachers that I interviewed, I mean, I think they can really be reduced down to one question per chapter, right? So there's one chapter that deals with the question of adapting Sufism in North America, and there's another chapter that deals with the relationship between Sufism and Islam. And really, those were the two main questions. Now, I asked those questions in a variety of ways, but the central question of each of those chapters was one, you know, when you're teaching Sufism in North America, what do you keep and what do you change? Most simply, you know what is the essence of the tradition that you are trying to transmit and preserve, and what are the ways in which you are adapting the Sufi tradition to convey that essence, to transmit that essence. The other question then is, you know, how do you understand the relationship between Sufism and Islam? And, you know, with that, there are correlate questions like, you know, do you have to be Muslim to be a Sufi? What does it really mean to be a Muslim? You know, that sort of thing. So those are really the two broad themes that I was interested in. Now, one, I was interested in those because when I started studying the subject, I noticed that those seem to be the points at which Sufi teachers diverged from one another. Those seem to be the pivots on which they would turn in one direction or another. So either they would say, these things must remain the same, and another teacher would say, no, these things we must change. And then you would get, you know, two branches of an order. Or in some cases, they would say, you know, look, you can only be a Sufi if you're also a devout Muslim. And some other teacher would say, well, no, you know, this is coming out of an Islamic context, but people can practice this without converting to Islam. And then you get, again, a divergence. So I was really drawn to those themes as I was encountering the tradition. I found, okay, these are the points of difference. And then the other thing that I would say about that is it's also how scholars have tended to classify Sufi groups in North America. They've tended to classify them based on either how much they've adapted their tradition to a North American context, or classify them based on their relationship to Islam. And so I think for those reasons, those were the two main themes that I was really interested in talking to Sufi leaders about. And again, because scholars have tended to classify teachers according to these things, I wanted to know what did they think about these issues? In their own words, how did they understand the relationship between Sufism and Islam? How did they articulate the choices they've made in adapting or not the tradition?
Yeah, and to tie it back to the two individuals that you framed the early Sufism in North America, Inayat Khan and René Guignon, you spoke with basically, you could say, the two living representatives of those streams, of those traditions, that being Sayyid Hussein Nasr and Pir Zia Khan. Is that right?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought them up, because I found, going into their perspectives and actually comparing their two perspectives in particular proved to be really interesting for me. Yeah. In part because I found that their articulations of the relationship between Sufism and Islam, although one would expect to be quite strongly in contrast to one another, actually were quite close. They overlapped in a number of interesting ways.
Yeah, and I feel like that was one thing that came through in the book, is that you were trying to, I guess you could say, quote unquote, problematize some of the categories. So you were saying that, some of these groups that say they're, or downplay or outright say they're not Muslims, but they're Sufis, they actually, in so many ways, are very similar, or in so many categories that check the box of what a traditional Sufi order is. And then on the other hand, those who are very much like Sharia grounded, Islam, Iman, Ihsan, traditionalists.
Yeah, that's right.
That they have a very universal vantage point on what Sufism is, what Islam itself is. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, and to me, this was one of the things that I thought was one of the most interesting findings of my fieldwork. And for me personally, it was a great affirmation of the importance of doing this. I had mentors and teachers in graduate school who, kept saying to me, cool, you're doing all this reading and you're getting all these categories and classifications and history and you're getting that down, but you should really go out and talk to people and spend time with people and see what happens. And that was one of, for me, the really interesting things about this project was going out, meeting with Sufi teachers, spending time at their centers, and having really in-depth conversations with them on these issues. And it really started to affect how I was seeing things. I guess one of the things that I really enjoyed about the project was the way in which my encounters with Sufi teachers and spending time with them to some degree dissolved the categories that I was working with. For instance, I found that Sayyid Hussein Nasr, who is one of the leading representatives of the traditionalist school of thought going back to Shuan and Gunan, he's a sheikh within the Maryamia tariqa or Sufi order founded by Fritjof Schuon. And he's somebody who, as a traditionalist in their mode, definitely understands truth and salvation to be found within the world's different religious traditions. So in that sense, he's what is called a perennialist. But like Guinan is somebody that believes that you need to integrally practice one of these traditions to fruitfully access the esoteric truth found within it. And so I thought, there's going to be a really sharp contrast between his understanding of Sufism and Islam than there would be with the perspective of Inayat Khan, and in this case, Zia Inayat Khan, basically Hazrat Inayat Khan's grandson, who is now the leader of what was the Sufi Order International, and now the Inayati Order, as it's recently been changed to. But what I found so interesting is that Zia Inayat Khan's articulation of the relationship between Sufism and Islam was actually quite close to Sayyid Hussein Nasr's. Zia Inayat Khan expressed concern that, universalism can be understood in an unnuanced way that totally dissolves the borders and boundaries between different traditions. And he feels that's actually a mischaracterization of his tradition. And in many respects, he's emphasizing the Inayati order's connection to Chishti Sufism in South Asia. And in many respects, he's sort of bringing back some classical Islamic principles and practices into the order. So I actually saw a lot of similarities between their approaches. One of the other things that I found very interesting was looking at Llewellyn Vaughan Lee in the Golden Sufi Center. Mm-hmm. That group in particular struck me as very fascinating because Vaughan Lee was one of the few teachers who explicitly identified as somebody who has a non-Islamic Sufi order. He was actually comfortable using that terminology. And that's in part because his teacher was a Russian woman, Irina Tweedy, who herself encountered a Hindu Sufi teacher in India. And what's so cool about this particular lineage is that this Hindu Sufi sheikh himself came from a family of Hindu Sufi teachers who had been initiated by a Muslim Sufi teacher. And his lineage was the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi. And what's so fascinating about this, if you know anything about the Naqshbandi Mujaddidis, they have historically been an Islamic revivalist Sufi order. So they were founded in the 17th century by Ahmed Sirhindi, who was a reviver of Islam. He's widely regarded as a reviver of Islam. He was somebody who didn't like the way that Sufism and Islam were being mixed with Hindu traditions in India. He wanted to revive adherence to the Sharia Islamic law and revive a strong sense of Muslim identity. But what's so fascinating is his lineage, the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi lineage, eventually became more and more open to Hindus. There were many Naqshbandi teachers who started saying, okay, well, we can initiate Hindus into this tradition. And at some point, there was a Muslim sheikh who even passed the lineage on in full to a Hindu family and made some of them teachers in their own right and told them, look, this is about the realization of truth, and your religious identity is totally secondary. So Llewellyn Vaughan Lee then inherits this tradition, which, because it had spent time in a Hindu context, wasn't really seen as being particularly Islamic at this point. But what I found so interesting is when I spent time with him and interviewed him, in many respects, he was a very traditional Naqshbandi teacher. He emphasized the importance of lineage, the golden chain, as the Naqshbandis call it, and going back to the Prophet Muhammad. He studied the principles of early Sufism and taught those to his students. There's nothing really, you might say, new age about this. The idea was that students would commit to a sheikh and would, practice daily traditional Naqshbandi forms of meditation. And so what I found here was this very interesting mix of a sort of non-Islamic form with a very traditional Sufi essence, we might say. And that sort of mixture just didn't seem to be adequately accounted for in the literature that I'd come across. People would assume that if a Sufi teacher was non-Muslim, then, well, this is probably just some kind of, new age, commercialized, ungrounded Sufism, unconnected with lineage and tradition. But I actually found something quite different with Vaughan Lee in the Golden Sufi Center. And I thought that was really important to highlight, that when you actually go and meet and speak with Sufi teachers, some of your categories are going to get blurred and even dissolved.
Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating. And, I love it, man. Like, I've had the opportunity to be amongst a wide spectrum of Sufi communities in North America. Yeah. And, it's just amazing, man, And one of the most amazing experiences when I was years ago, a friend of mine, it was Ramadan. It was the last, it was Laylatul Qadr. It was the 27th night. And a friend of mine was like, hey, we're going up to Pope Valley, which is north of the Bay Area by a few hours. We're going to the Sufi Center, and they're having some, celebration for this special night. So I said, okay, let's go. So I drove up with them, and we get up there. It's right by Napa Valley, right by wine country. And
Okay.
we're out in the woods, like literally middle of nowhere. And I walk into this room, and it's like 300 middle-aged white, like rural people, and they're all like, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadun Rasulullah, alayhi salatullah, and like chanting and doing dhikr and like praying like qiyamul layl and tahajjud and tarawih and like staying up all night chanting the divine names. And I was just like, whoa, this is an alternate universe.
Right.
You know, because my exposure to Islam was very much like an urban Islam. So like I always try to tell people that, you know, like it might be hard for people to get, but like my Islam was very much through like hip hop. And so like the whole like Black Muslims, Malcolm and that whole thing, those were the Muslims that I knew. And then, but also because like some of my elders had really gone through the counterculture 60s and 70s, like Rumi, you know, like the Rumi texts were everywhere in the houses that I grew up with and of my best friends and stuff like that. And so it was like really, you know, Rumi and Malcolm, or as my friend Amir Suleiman says, Rakim and Rumi, you know, it's like, and but you know, I was very much like always interested in Sufism, but like the actual like Muslims I knew were very much like that, come from that like urban trajectory. And so to see like this, a whole, you know, demographic that is clearly not being reached by anyone else, you could say, within the Muslim community, is being reached through this. And that community is the Shadili Sufi order. And Sheikh Muhammad Jamal from Palestine, he was the Mufti of Jerusalem, and I got to meet him. He passed away about a year or so ago, but you know, it was just fascinating. And he was the type of person who, again, like an alim, like a well-respected sheikh of the sacred law, of the Sharia, and a Sufi sheikh as well. And he comes to America and he realizes like, okay, I'm going to have to adapt this to a context. And actually, I don't know if you know the story, but apparently there was a kind of, you know, new age spiritual teacher who was a big deal apparently. And, you know, he was doing channeling and psychic work and all this stuff. And he met the Sheikh Muhammad and basically was so transformed by his presence that he took the Sufi path and became Muslim. He became Ibrahim Jaffe. And so his whole following, which was like hundreds of people, it took the path with him.
Wow.
And so, you know, I mean, but there's communities like that people just don't necessarily know about. And, you know, I'm so fascinated by the whole thing, you know. And one of the beautiful stories that you highlight in the book was the Jarrahis. And I think this is an amazing example because, you know, Sheikh Muzaffar Effendi, who was just an amazing individual, and his life is very just fascinating. But he had the insight to realize, okay, there's some people that want the spiritual, you know, and it comes down to like the whole, you know, age-old debate of the letter versus the spirit. You know?
That's right.
And so he said some people want the spirit, but they're not really interested in the letter. And some people want the more traditional, the whole piece, you know, the whole traditional way that we've always, you know, we've done things. And so he made way for both. So maybe you could tell a little bit about the story and the woman, the sheikha that you interviewed.
Yeah, I really enjoyed encountering the Jarrahi tradition. And you know, it's interesting how through somebody's students, sometimes you kind of get a sense of who their teacher was. And certainly with Sheikh Muzaffar, there was a really powerful sense of his spiritual, you know, charisma. Robert Fraser and Friha al-Jarrahi, both of whom I interviewed and who represent two different branches of his order, both gave this really incredible sense of being transformed just by his glance or presence. And yeah, I mean, one of the things I really liked about in encountering that tradition was it really illustrates well how how I think some of these boundaries get blurred. I mean, if you look at some of the things that Sheikh Muzaffar said, one of the most beautiful stories that I really enjoyed hearing was from Robert Fraser, who said that some of Sheikh Muzaffar's students were taking him around the United States. He's visiting from Istanbul. And they brought him to a research university and to a laboratory, and he was really kind of intrigued by some of the scientific work that was being done there. And he was very impressed and was saying a lot of really elevated things about the research scientists. And one of his students said, "Well, Sheikh, many of these people are atheists." And he responded, "Well," he said, "they're devoting their life to studying haqq, to studying truth." And he said, and that's one of God's names. So he said, maybe they're better Muslims than we are. And so this is a teacher who, as you say, was somebody who was, he was an imam. He was a prayer leader. He had an Islamic bookstore. He was very well grounded in the traditions of fiqh, Islamic law, in the traditions of Islamic theology. He very much represents a classical model of Sufism, which is, Sharia, tariqa, haqiqa. That you start with the law, and that the boundaries of the law contain the spiritual path, and within that you take the spiritual path to haqiqa, to the truth, to reality. And so, and that's one of the stories that I love, because it illustrates so well that even somebody who is very much grounded in the Islamic tradition and understands Sufism as integral to the Islamic tradition also had this generosity of spirit and this openness to realize that the deep meaning of Islam is something that goes beyond communal identification. That, and I saw that from a lot of the Jarahis. They said, look, Islam has this much deeper, more universal meaning. It's not just about, are you praying 5 times a day? It's how are you praying? What's your state while you're praying? Sheikh Muzaffar also said sometimes Muslims are the hardest people to make Muslim. Like sometimes if you get a spiritual ego, it's actually really tough to penetrate that, to get you to a place of genuine surrender to God, as opposed to, just simply a sense of identity. And so I think that kind of deeper understanding of Islam, Muslim, was really interesting to hear, especially coming out of a tradition like that. There's a lot that I could say about that, about the Jarahi tradition in particular.
Yeah, because what's amazing, right, is that Sheikh Muzaffar he made a Turkish disciple, made him the head of a very Turkish style tekke or Sufi center that was basically doing exactly what they're doing back in Turkey at the kind of mother center of their Jarahis. But then on the other hand, he saw that there's this Noor Lex Hickson, who was a really amazing, interesting individual, had a radio show interviewing all the different spiritual teachers at the time, had a PhD from Yale in religious studies, and is practicing multiple different traditions, and, takes the path, becomes a Sufi, becomes a Muslim with Sheikh Muzaffar. And so he sees in him something special, and he says, I'm going to put you in charge of this center that we have in Manhattan. And it's going to be very much modeled for seekers, for people that aren't necessarily interested in Islam, but they want to draw near to the divine presence. They want to do, chanting or remembrance or meditation or these type of things. And I think that is so fascinating that within that order, you kind of have 2 branches that come off from Muzaffar's insight, that there's 2 kind of type of seekers that are interested in Sufism.
Yes. Yeah, I think that is such a good example of that. He seemed to foster these 2 different approaches, and right. So then you have Lex Hickson, who has a branch of the Jarahi order, which then Sheikh Fariha, who's the current representative, the current sheikh of that order, takes over from Hickson, and continues this model of a very open approach to Sufism. I mean, she herself is a Muslim, and it's a very, we might say, Islamically oriented order in the sense that they're preserving the traditional prayers, and she teaches Salat, and they recite the Quran, and their center in New York is a mosque, But it's also very open. She says, look, I don't teach Salat as an obligation. I teach it as a door to spiritual knowledge. So, it's not something you have to do, but if you try it out, you might find that it's really helping your path. So it's a sort of interesting approach. And for her, you don't have to be a Muslim to be a part of her particular branch of the Jarahi order. Whereas if you look at the one that was taught by Tosin Bayrak was another one of the students of Sheikh Muzaffar Ozak, that is a branch that you do have to be Muslim to be a part of. Mm-hmm. And, the daily prayers and things are taught in a more traditional way of being obligations of Sharia upon you. So in a way, they look similar in the sense that the practices they do are very similar, but their understanding of them is quite different. Mm. I think one other example of that I find so fascinating is Baba Muhayyiddin. Mm. And Baba Muhayyiddin, like Sheikh Muzaffar, and maybe even to a greater degree, taught people different approaches. And I found this when I went to the Baba Muhayyiddin Fellowship in Philadelphia. I was talking to the students, and it was so interesting. I met the imam of their masjid, who I attended his Friday khutbah, his Friday sermon. I mean, and it was a fire and brimstone sermon. It's one of those sermons that's very old school. The day of judgment is coming, and who do you think you are that you're going to be okay on that day? Look at yourself, look at how you live, and rectify yourself. It was, very sort of classic prophetic, sermon, warning. And so you have this very, we might say, Islamic sense of Bawa's teachings. I talked to another one of his students who said, I almost didn't want to talk to you because you're studying Sufism, and I don't even call this Sufism, let alone Islam. This has no category whatsoever. Bawa never taught me to pray 5 times a day. Bawa never taught me to label myself anything. He taught me just the oneness of reality and how to realize that in each moment, and how to live the qualities of God, the names of God, love, mercy, compassion, wisdom, just how to adopt and live those qualities in my life. And that's all he taught me. So to call it Islam, to call it Sufism, it's completely outside of any of those boxes. Mm. So to meet people like that, who had such contrasting understandings of Bawa's teachings, and then, the more that I looked at the tradition, to realize that that's how he very consciously taught it. He told some people, yes, praying 5 times a day will be good for you. That's something that you should do. He had them build a mosque. But for other of his students, he wouldn't mention any of those types of practices for them. And again, you get then these different understandings of what his teachings are and what Sufism is.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. And I read this book. It was really an amazing book. I think it's called Muzaffar Effendi and the Transmission of Sufism to the West, which is about Muzaffar Effendi.
I know. Yeah, it's a great book.
It's an amazing book. And I literally found it. It was super random, but I just found it when I was in Konya this year. And I felt like it was definitely for me to read. Like, it was on a bookshelf at a restaurant. There was no other books. And I asked the waiter, why is this book here? And he goes, I don't know. And then I was like, I feel like this book's for me, but I didn't want to ask for it. And he goes, do you want it? And I said, yes. He said, okay, just bring it back when you're done reading it. And I was like, okay. So I went and read it and brought it back, and it was one of the most profound, beautiful books I read. And you really get a sense of just how vast Sheikh Muzaffar Effendi was of just a soul. And, one thing though, the story that they told in that is that Muzaffar Effendi met some of the disciples of Bawa who had passed on by then. And they told him, they said, Bawa, for 10 years, all he taught us was La ilaha illallah. All he taught us is there's no God but God. There's no one but the one. And they said, Muzaffar said, we should have done that. And
that's awesome.
I thought that was so beautiful. And, what a lot of people don't know is that Bawa is the key. He's the reason that Rumi is the #1 selling poet in America, because amongst his students was a young man named Coleman Barks.
That's right.
And Bawa told him, basically, you have to translate this. And, I heard Coleman, or I read something that he wrote talking about his time with Bawa, and he said, we prayed 5 times a day. But it was never a question of this is obligatory or not. Like, that never crossed into our mind. It was done out of pure love and devotion to the ultimate reality.
Okay.
And I just thought that was, wow, when he said that. And, you can see on YouTube videos of Bawa and some of him talking, some of him singing, the ones of him singing particularly.
Yeah.
Like, and you could tell, like, this is not a normal human being. Like, there's something so special and unique about him. Like, who is this person?
Even the pictures. I mean, you see a picture of Bawa and it's like, you're not entirely sure he comes from this planet.
Yep, exactly. And they say, like, they found him somewhere in the jungle in Sri Lanka. Like, where'd you come from? But, yeah, I mean, and there's so many amazing, like, characters and movements. And, I guess one of the questions that I had for you is, if we step back and we look at, Sufism as this quote-unquote, obviously, Eastern tradition coming to the West, and then if we were to compare that a little bit to what happens with other traditions, because I read a book. Well, there's a few books. There's one book called How the Swans Came to the Lake, which is kind of like a classic about Buddhism coming to America, which has a lot of good information in it. But then more recently, there's a book called American Veda, or Vedas. I think Philip Goldberg, I believe is his name, right?
Yeah, actually, I was able to meet him at a conference a few years back. Very cool guy, and I think a very interesting book. Yeah,
that book, I love that book, man. I read it cover to cover. I read it multiple times, highlighting things, because it's not just a history, but he really has a lot of really profound reflections on. Because if you think about it, Hinduism is unique because very few Americans became Hindu. Like, it's not a big thing. Like, way fewer probably than became Muslim, I would guess, although I don't know.
That's right. Yeah.
But how ubiquitous is, the influence of Hinduism on American culture. I mean, it's unbelievable. If you just, yoga studios on every corner. The term enlightenment, in nirvana, reincarnation, karma. Like, all these terms, they didn't exist. Like, Western people didn't know about them 100 years ago, except outside of, like, very obscure, like, scholarship, right? So it's like, now there's just so influential, and he traces why that happened and how that happened. And one thing that he says, that you had all these, Hindu masters coming to America, and he said there were some that were successful and some that weren't. And he argues that the ones that were successful, what they had in common is that they downplayed Hinduism as a religion, and that they emphasized is, they said, this is a science of consciousness transformation. This is a science. Right. And those were the ones that were successful. And, he says so much more. But one thing he says that is related to this that I never forgot, he said religion has it fulfills 5 things. And he put the prefix trans. I'm not sure if I can remember them all, but there's like transmission, translation, transaction, transformation, and transcendence. Those are the 5. And so transaction is like the rules, like the sacred law. And then, the other things are relating to, transmission, of course, is like the tradition. Like, in Islam, it's like the hadith and all these things, all the information that's passed on generation from generation. But then when you get to the higher 2, he draws a line. The higher 2 are transformation and transcendence. So you could say the inner 2, the more kind of like what we would associate with the esoteric or the contemplative. And he says that you have to understand is that Western religion had failed to fulfill these higher 2. They'd failed to fulfill transformation and transcendence anymore. And so that is the reason that all these people are turning east for spirituality. And what they're really seeking, they're not seeking for another set of rules. They're not really even seeking for another history, another bunch of stuff to memorize. You know what I mean? But they're really seeking for transformation and transcendence.
Yes.
And so the teachers, the Hindu teachers that emphasize that, while kind of downplaying the other elements, were the ones that were successful.
Right.
So I'm curious if you could speak to that within the Islamic context, or how you think that plays out.
I really like that analysis, and I think there's a lot to that. I think it also ties in with, and I know I've mentioned before, Robert Wuthnow's work, where he talked about this idea of, North American religiosity shifting from a spirituality of dwelling, which is, a spirituality based in a local church or synagogue or temple, and one that really offers you more tradition, community, but not really so much transformation and transcendence. It's a very domestic form of religion. And it fit with a lot of what people wanted in the interwar years and in the post-World War II years, building families, economic boom. And I think what he argues is that then we see in the 1960s this shift to a spirituality of seeking, and I think it dovetails with this analysis that for those young people who were craving something more, who wanted transformation and transcendence, they weren't getting that in this domestic local congregation that was basically just sort of, preserving the norms of the community and giving people a sense of continuity and stability. They didn't want continuity and stability. They wanted adventure. They wanted challenge. They wanted to question things in a very profound way and experience things in a very visceral way. And of course, we see this with like the Beat movement, the fascination with Zen, and then eventually the psychedelic movement. And then, of course, the growth of these contemplative traditions coming out of Hindu and Buddhist and Muslim contexts. So, I think it's a very good analysis. And it's interesting that you see, one of the ways to think about this is when you look at Swami Vivekananda, who was one of the first Hindu teachers to come over to the West. He actually came over for the World Fair in Chicago in the 1890s. And the World's Parliament of Religions, right? They had this bringing representatives from different religions together in Chicago. And so Vivekananda, he blew people's minds. He was the sensation of the event. And how he presented Hinduism was precisely as you're describing. He didn't say, look, you need to, and really some people have argued you can't really convert to Hinduism because it's, there's the caste system and you can't really convert into a caste. But he didn't present it as something, look, there's a caste system and there are, the laws of Manu, governing social relations. That's not what he presented at all. What he presented was, we might say, something that he formulated as the spiritual essence of Hinduism, which he believed was the Vedanta tradition. And he presented it precisely as a science of mind and consciousness and spirit, as something that wasn't dogmatic, as something that wasn't going to get in a fight with science. And this is another thing, too. A lot of North Americans were kind of weary of this religion-science battle. And, the profound successes of the scientific tradition seemed for a lot of them to put religion on its back feet. And so to have a tradition that wasn't saying, no, I'm going to, stand on the ground of dogma and unquestioned belief in the face of science, people were drawn to somebody who was saying, no, actually, we don't have to take that stance, that spirituality, spiritual practice and science can coincide very closely. And so it was a very popular presentation. So again, he didn't teach Hinduism, he taught Vedanta, right? And I think there's a very strong parallel there with how Inayat Khan, who's coming, remember, just about a decade or so after Swami Vivekananda, Inayat Khan then does almost essentially the same thing with the Sufi Islamic tradition. He doesn't come in saying, here are the basics of the Sharia. You're going to have to stop eating bacon in the mornings and that sort of thing. He's not so concerned with that. He's concerned with teaching the spiritual essence, which he calls Sufism or just the message, as he would eventually call it. And so again, you see a very similar pattern of saying, look, this is something that here are a set of practices that you can experiment with. Here's a belief that isn't dogmatic, that isn't sectarian, that is opening to a universal era and understanding. And it was successful largely in that he gained a concerted group of followers. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the cool things, and I would love to do more on this in the future, or see more people do this, is more comparative work. You know, I mean, because you see so many of the same patterns in how Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims have adapted their traditions. And in a way, you know, you could put it simply, two ways. When there's the old Sufi saying, you know, water takes on the color of the container that you pour it into. You know, so when you are pouring a contemplative tradition into a North American container, you know, it will take on some of the colors of the North American context, right? And the other way to think about that is if you want to communicate something to people, you need to speak their language, or they won't understand you. And it's not simply, language isn't just English, you know, language is the conceptual framework that you're operating within. And so if these teachers didn't present their contemplative traditions in ways that resonated with North Americans, then yeah, they wouldn't be successful, and they wouldn't actually do their mission as they understood it, which was to complete their mission, which was to transmit these teachings, right? So.
Another thing those are all really good points. And another thing that relates to that I've been thinking about a lot. For instance, living for a long time in the Bay Area, the Bay Area has been a center for a lot of counterculture stuff, but you mentioned like Buddhism. There's a lot of Buddhist communities in the Bay Area. And one thing that I noticed, because in San Francisco as well as Oakland, there's you know, a very large Chinatown, an old Chinatown. And, and then there's Japantown as well in San Francisco. Yeah. And there's a lot of Buddhist centers there that are very much culturally Chinese. And you don't see, you know, American people there.
No.
Like, you know, but then, you know, San Francisco Zen Center, you know, and then all these other, you know, large Buddhist organizations that they're almost like parallel universes is what I'm getting at. Is there's all these like converts to Buddhism, or now even like children of converts to Buddhism. And then there's the kind of like immigrant Buddhism, if you will. Yeah. And they totally exist in different universes. Like there's really, like, now a lot of the convert Buddhist communities, they take from or draw from or get their lineage from a, you know, teacher from wherever, you know, where it be Vietnam or Thailand or China or you know, Japan or anywhere, you know, a traditional teacher representative, but that representative then is basically spreading this message within the context of converts. And then now you have a lot of course, teachers who maybe studied overseas with these Buddhist masters, or, you know, the Buddhist masters came here and trained them. And so, you know, you have these huge Buddhist teachers who are then now passing on the tradition as Westerners, born and raised in this culture. And I think about the Islamic context and how, you know, in 1965, I believe, that's when the Immigration Act passed, so that now all of a sudden non-Europeans can come to America, which means now for the first time really in large numbers you have Muslims immigrating from the majority Muslim lands. And this significantly alters Islam and Sufism and the trajectories. And this brings up a lot of that tension where you say, okay, there was a lot of seekers who were kind of experiencing Islam within a context of their Americanness, which may or may not have looked a lot like traditional Islamic Sufism. Mm-hmm. And then that coming into tension with people coming with their, you know, immigrant Islamic Sufi order practices and saying, hey, these don't line up. And so I'm just curious about how you would kind of reflect on the differences or similarities with the Buddhist community, because I feel like there's some communities, Sufi communities, which are very much, you know, American converts. And then there's others which are very much immigrant Sufism, and then there's increasingly, I would say, a lot where there's a mix.
That's right. Yeah. And there's so many interesting parallels there, and I think part of the way I think about that is these different approaches, these different centers. So, right, obviously in the Buddhist context, you think of something like a Zen center or a Tibetan Buddhist meditation center, and then you think of something like a Buddhist temple or a Buddhist church, as some of them are called in Japanese communities. But really, part of the way to think about how these centers function is I would argue that in some cases, in many cases, they're serving different needs, right? So if you think of the needs of an immigrant community, to have a community center where they can get together with people who share their background and they can network and they can maintain and preserve community. They can engage with their traditions in a way that connects them with home, and they do that together. And so those centers are serving a very different need than a Zen center, where again it's for people who aren't so much questing for those things as they are for transformation and transcendence. And so I think, and then of course you see places where those things come together. So maybe one thing that comes to mind within the Islamic context is, again, to go back to the Baba Mujahideen Fellowship. And myself and a colleague, Shabana Xavier, recently published an article on this, was the shrine of Baba Mujahideen is really cool in a way, because it's one of the first Sufi shrines in North America, where for many Muslims and Sufis, it's believed that there's a Sufi saint buried there, Baba Mujahideen. And this shrine is located on the Baba Mujahideen Fellowship's farm just outside of Philadelphia. Beautiful site. I mean, I strongly encourage anybody who can get there to go check it out. It's a very, very cool place. And beautiful mazar, beautiful tomb shrine built for Baba Mujahideen's body. And what's so cool about this is this shrine brings together these various elements, like we might call this sort of the convert Sufis, the convert Muslims, and also immigrant Muslim communities. And the story of how they're brought together is quite cool as well. So Baba Mujahideen has, first of all, Baba Mujahideen was a teacher who really did, I think, unify people. He was somebody who was actually invited to North America in part to help deal with racial tensions in Philadelphia. People there felt like we need somebody who's teaching, oneness and bringing people together. And so right when Baba Mujahideen landed, he had African American, he had, white followers, he had Jewish, go on down the list of people from various backgrounds were coming to be involved with his group. But what's so interesting about his shrine now is that the people who built the shrine when he died were primarily his convert followers, many of whom understood Sufism in a, what we might say, relatively universalistic way. Some were, as I've described, quite devout Muslims, but some weren't. Some related to Baba more as a guru, as a spiritual teacher. So they build the shrine, and the shrine then becomes a space of meditation and prayer. But what's so interesting is at some point there is a Gujarati American who goes and visits the center and has a spiritual experience there. And for many Gujarati Muslims, making a pilgrimage to a Sufi shrine and then having a celebration there, including basically things like a barbecue and a communal gathering, having people come in and singing religious songs, sitting at the shrine and seeking the blessings of the saint, the Baraka of the saint, that's a huge part of their understanding of Islam. And so he was thrilled to encounter this because he felt like, okay, great, now we can actually, replicate some of our Indian Muslim practice here in North America. So he starts emailing and phoning his family and friends, primarily, again, Gujarati Americans across the Eastern Seaboard and beyond. And so they start having what was called the Gujarati Family Gathering. And they, by within a few years of this discovery, there are hundreds of Gujarati Americans, their families, coming to this shrine and holding traditional Indian Sufi celebrations there, bringing in Sufi teachers from different traditions from their cultural background to recite religious songs. And so you've got this fascinating confluence of these converts who at first weren't really sure what to make of this. They thought, "Wow, what's happening at the shrine?" But they've kind of negotiated this sharing of the space, and so I think that's one site where you see this very interesting connection, where people are using the site to preserve community and religious tradition. But in a way, they're all united in their seeking of transcendence. They're all looking for some transcendence through the presence of the saint.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Well, when I read the book, I had a joke in my mind because I've had the opportunity to sit with Dr. Sherman Jackson multiple times, and he wrote a book called Islam and the Black American, which is an amazing book, and it really documents the trajectory, really, of black people into Islam in the Americas. And he talks about what he calls proto-Islamic movements, so the Moorish Science Temple and the 5% Nation of Gods and Earths, and of course the Nation of Islam being the largest. And it's just very interesting, a lot of the things he says, but he really talks about this idea of black protest religion and how it all comes out of this kind of like self-definition vis-a-vis whiteness versus blackness and all this stuff, and just black protest religion having its own kind of canon and its own foundations across the board, whether it's Islam or Christianity, or even you could probably tie in things like Rastafari and things of that nature. But I was laughing when I read your book because I was like, finally someone's written Islam in the white American. Because, I mean, this is, and I think it's really fascinating, by the way. I've always reflected on this, that like, of course you mentioned the problem with the words quasi-Islamic. Of course, that's kind of derogatory, but if we're going to use that in air quotes, or proto-Islamic, where basically if you have within the black community, the mainstream to Islam is the Nation of Islam and other organizations which, for the vast majority of quote-unquote Orthodox Muslims, the foundational principles are highly problematic. And then on the other hand, for most white Americans coming into Islam, the stream is through Sufism, and often through Sufi movements or orders which, like, Inayat Khan, don't, or are taught or are practiced in ways that for orthodoxy or orthopraxy, quote unquote, again, are highly problematic, shall we say. And so I think it's just fascinating, like that these are the two streams, and yet, you know what I mean? But I'm glad you said that about Bawa, because that's really fascinating, is that he really reached across the racial line. And one thing that when you were talking about Bawa and his tomb becoming this place of pilgrimage, I was reflecting on Malcolm X, and that his tomb has also become a place of pilgrimage. And I know many groups of African American and Latino Sufi Muslims who go there and, of course, are praying for him and are venerating him and are reading the Yasin and Fatiha for him in the same way that, like you say, that Sufi saints are visited all over the Muslim world. And, one of the fascinating, and in their articulation of it, and they do it annually, and they'll say, for them, Malcolm is a Muslim Sufi saint. And the reason is because he connected, he liberated, he connected them with the African roots, which is the vast majority of African Muslims, of course, being Sufis. And so that's their ancestry. And it's really fascinating, too, because I actually read something recently which says 92% of Muslims in Senegal claim affiliation to a Sufi order.
Right.
And a huge percentage of the enslaved Africans came from Senegal and things of that nature. So I think it's really fascinating, and I'm glad that in your book you did talk about the Tijaniya, because the Tijaniya are very interesting in that, especially the through Ibrahim Niasse in Senegal, that branch is, it's very, and I've had the blessing of going to Senegal and spending time there, is that it's like very African, and it's very unapologetically African. It's very, amazing and beautiful. And so, Sheikh Hassan Cisse, who started coming, I believe, in the 90s to America, he had a profound effect on African Americans who saw this African Sufi sheikh who is, spiritual master and has millions of followers all over Africa and beyond. And I think that's fascinating how you highlighted this order that, you look at the Tijaniya, they spread in America specifically amongst African Americans. Now, I know white Americans and Asians and others that have become Tijani, but the vast majority of them are African Americans. And for those that I've talked to, they've mentioned it's, for me, I need a black sheikh. Like, my sheikh has to be black, because for me, it's about connecting with my ancestral. Like, I'm not going to substitute like a white person telling me, what my religion is for an Arab person telling me. Like, I need, you see what I'm saying?
Right.
So,
yeah, I do.
And so I just think it's really fascinating. And those are just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, and I think what's cool about that is for me, that makes me think of this broader point that when you're looking at the different forms that something like Sufism is taking in North America, I think what you're partly seeing is people's different needs being fulfilled. If you're a middle-class white American who, is not getting what you need, you're not getting the spiritual juice that you need, that from this sort of domestic local congregation of whatever background. So you go out on the spiritual quest for transformation. You have certain needs that you're seeking to be fulfilled. And so, you will find that there are certain Sufi teachings that do that. If you're an African American who's looking to connect with your identity that has been, obscured and repressed over the centuries, and to connect with a sense of Africanness and spirituality, well, there are Sufi orders that can fulfill that need, right? If you're an immigrant Muslim who is trying to make your way in this country and trying to, at the same time, connect with who you are and your background and your community, well, there are Sufi orders that can help you do that, right? And so I think one of the things that I found interesting talking to Sufi teachers was, sometimes they would say, look, the reason why we teach this particular way is because our sheikh told us, look, some people are going to need to learn it this way. So that's why you should do this, and they don't have a sense of this is for everyone. Like Llewellyn Van Lee is another example where he said, look, the reason why we have a very formless approach to Sufism, he said there's no rituals of initiation. We have some very basic meditation practices, but it's almost as formless as you can get of an approach to the spiritual path. But he said our teachers told us to teach it that way because it's going to work for some people. And he said other people teach it much more connected with ritual and tradition and Islamic life and practice because that's going to work for some people. And he said there's no problem here. We're not saying that they're doing something wrong and we're doing something right. We're just meeting different needs. And so I think that's a very interesting way to think about it is teachers from the past essentially starting to orient different traditions to meet different needs. And so to me, that's great. There's nothing problematic in that.
For sure. Yeah, man, I loved your book. And so Sufism in North America, what's the subtitle?
Yeah, so Living Sufism in North America Between Tradition and Transformation.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. And people can get that anywhere, everywhere, Amazon, taken over the world. It's available on Amazon.
You can get it now in soft cover, so it's more around $30, which is great because I think initially when it came out, it was hardcover. It was more like $80. You can get it on Kindle for I think even cheaper than that. So, but I just want to say thanks for the invite, and it's an honor to be a part of the work that you're doing, and I'm just really happy that you enjoyed the book. So
my pleasure, man. No, I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to in whatever you're doing next. What are you doing next? You got any research projects or anything like that?
Yeah, actually, a couple things on the go. That one is a book that's going to be an introductory text to Sufism, and that's written with my former PhD supervisor, Professor Mina Sharifi Funk. We've got a book called Unveiling Sufism from Manhattan to Mecca, and this is an introductory text that we're taking a different approach in the sense that it starts with contemporary Sufism in North America, and then in each chapter it goes back through the historical periods. So the second chapter then deals with the colonial period, looking at people like Abdul Qadir in Algeria and his resistance against the French invasions. And then, moving back to the medieval period, classical Sufism, and then to the early Sufi tradition and its origins. And in each historical era, we look at different manifestations of Sufism. So we have a section on Sufi philosophy and doctrine. We have a section on the arts, the ways in which Sufism manifested artistically. We have a section on politics, the way that the Sufis of that period related to political powers and structures, and then, some of the history. And so that book we have complete. It's going to be with Equinox Press, and that should be coming out next year. And we hope it'll contribute to kind of a rich, three-dimensional take on Sufism. And then there's one more project that I'm working on with Mina Sharifi Funk and Shabana Xavier on contemporary Sufism, looking at some of the patterns that we're seeing across the world with contemporary Sufi practice in terms of how Sufis are responding to anti-Sufi movements, which are quite powerful right now. The role of gender in Sufism across the world, how are women participating and leading in Sufi traditions across the world, and then, of course, the interface of Sufism and pop culture. So that book on contemporary Sufism is with Routledge, and that's still being worked on. So that'll be coming out probably later 2017, I would think. But
MashaAllah. Cool, man. Well, I love the book, and I love talking to you about it too. It's really beautiful because it's one of those books that is close to home. Like I felt like I was learning about myself and my own people I know and my own family, my own tribe and stuff like that. So, yeah, man, beautiful. I loved it, and I look forward to reading whatever you put out next.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It feels great to hear the positive feedback, and like I said, a real honor to participate in your work, and look forward to talking about future projects. So.
Cool. All right, brother. Thanks for giving us your time.
Hey, thank you. Peace.
Peace.